They shared a smile on stage for decades. Norma Jean, the angel-voiced beauty whom America loved, and Porter Wagoner, the sparkling country music showman. Fans thought their relationship was picture-perfect as it glowed on TV screens. However, something was falling apart beneath the delicate harmonies and sequins. Silent glances, awkward silences, and finally a heartbreaking departure. Norma Jean stepped out of the spotlight just as abruptly as she had stepped into it. For years there were rumors of betrayal, heartache, and tyranny. Norma Jean is finally speaking out at the age of 87. And everything you believe to be true about Porter Wagoner will be altered by what she says. Norma Jean Beasler had neither connections nor privilege. In 1938, she was born in the little Oklahoman hamlet of Wellston. Brought up with a strong work ethic, faith, and the straightforward lyricism of country music on dusty radios. She began singing on local stations when she was 12 years old. Her singing had become her escape by the age of 16. Gentle yet strong, full of genuineness. With her organic phrasing and passionate delivery, Norma Jean stood out in a time when female performers were frequently viewed as supporting roles. She had no intention of being someone else. It was enough that she was herself. Country music icon Red Foley noticed her in the 1950s and asked her to participate in the Ozark Jubilee. It was a significant shift, but not without difficulties. The stage was dominated by men. Women were frequently greeted with a pat on the head, a smile, and 2 songs. However, it was impossible to overlook Norma Jean's presence. She sang with passion, her words brimming with either down-home delight or silent despair. She was loved by fans, and Porter Wagoner soon followed. Porter asked Norma Jean to work with him on The Porter Wagoner Show, his new television endeavor, in 1961. The deal guaranteed visibility across the country. For Norma, it was a rhinestone-encrusted dream. The format was fast-paced, the set was bright, and the audience size was astounding. Millions of Americans watched the tall, glittery wager and the lovely, modest young woman by his side every week. At least they clicked right away on screen. Porter was the endearing host. The role of the grounded sweetheart was played by Norma Jean. She performed gospel music that moved listeners to tears, and well-known country ballads that gained popularity. She made it to the charts with her renditions of Let's Go All the Way and Go Cat Go. Off camera, however, there was something more profound going on that no fan could see. Later, Norma Jean acknowledged that she was conflicted during those years. She was living her dream on the one hand. Conversely, she was integrating into someone else's vision. The majority of her choices, including what she performed, her attire, and even her speech, were decided by Porter. He was possessive as well as protective. She felt confined even though she was appreciative. She was now referred to as Porter's girl. Even though it made her famous, it gradually eroded her sense of self. She nevertheless gave the show her all. Many fans wrote letters. Oprah, the elderly, called. She received award nominations. However, fissures had already begun to appear beneath the surface. It was felt by those near the production. Norma was more than simply worn out. She was starting to wonder about everything. When questioned years later about why she had stayed so long, she merely replied, "I didn't know I could leave." In that one remark, you could hear the anguish of a young lady caught between silence and appreciation. Porter Wagoner was a shining example of rustic hospitality to the general population. A voice that sounded like the heartland itself, broad smiles and flashy suits. However, beneath that refined exterior lay a man who was intensely motivated by regularity, control, and a fixation with perfection. Everything on the Porter Wagoner show flowed to his beat. Norma Jean was supposed to follow along. The star wasn't all that Wagoner was. The entire production was designed by him. He selected the visitors, the running order, and the musical arrangements. He was even able to influence the camera angles. In every way possible, it was his show, and it meant following the rules for anyone who worked for him, especially a young female co-star. Although Norma was appreciative of the publicity, she quickly came to understand that she was more than just Porter's vocal partner. She was a carefully chosen fixture that was a part of his brand. Norma recalls the restrictions placed on her speech during tapings, as well as her song selections and attire. She desired to explore new things, write more of her own writing, and display a different side of herself. However, Porter resisted. He would explain that people want to see the Norma they know. However, the version of Norma he wanted the world to see wasn't always the real one. The control grew stronger as the months stretched into years. Porter would become agitated off camera if she disregarded his advice. She started to realize that there were conditions attached to her achievement. She received subtle punishment or coldness if she pushed too hard or moved out of his line of sight. Less time on camera, fewer songs, and private talks masquerading as mentoring. Decades later, Norma Jean spoke in interviews about feeling as though she was in a gold cage. She wasn't free, but everything looked lovely, and her spirit started to wane gradually. Although Porter seldom ever spoke, his silent methods of controlling others, his silence, his dismissals, and his capacity to cut someone off without warning were equally painful. Coworkers on the program started to take notice. Once so vivacious, Norma Jean was more reserved in between takes. Her eyes began to look far away, yet the enthusiasm in her voice remained. As one crew member remembered, she had left the stage grinning, but as soon as she was out of the spotlight, she was emotionally and physically worn out. But despite everything, Norma never voiced any complaints in public. She thought Porter was talented and appreciated him. Admiration, however, cannot take away uneasiness. Elevated by his success but depressed by his urge to control everything around him, she felt herself living in his shadow. She remained, nevertheless. Fear, perhaps. It might have been loyalty. Perhaps it was the goal she had worked so hard to achieve. However, the price of that silence would increase over the years. Porter's tightly drawn curtain was beginning to seem oppressive. Norma Jean started to question whether she might permanently lose her voice if she didn't regain it quickly. The Porter Wagoner Show was one of the most popular shows on country music television by the middle of the 1960s. The dazzling suits, the smooth introductions, and the synchronized voices of Porter and Norma Jean drew millions of viewers each week. However, something more intricate was taking place beneath the flawless harmonies. Something that was only discussed in whispers. There had started to be rumors that Porter and Norma Jean were dating. Neither made a public confirmation. Despite their insistence that it was solely professional, their enthusiasm seemed to contradict this. Their interactions off camera were intense, at times friendly and at other times tense. Despite her careful word choice, Norma eventually acknowledged that there was emotional attachment. Although she didn't place blame or make accusations, she also didn't deny the relationship. Despite being split from his wife, Porter, who was married during the early run of the program, continued to project the image of a devoted family man. Navigating this hazy boundary between adoration and reliance became more challenging for Norma Jean. She even had a profound affection for him. However, she also started to feel like a kept woman in a society that discouraged women like her from speaking up. Arguments, some loud, others quiet, were common. Members of the crew remembered seeing red-eyed Norma Jean come out of the changing rooms. If she questioned one of Porter's choices, others immediately noted a change in his attitude. A forgotten cue, a missing note. Norma's minor errors appeared to be accentuated. On certain days, their teasing was lighthearted. On other days, they remained silent. The connection on stage, however, remained electrifying. It contributed to the strain. Viewers witnessed a powerful pair. They were blind to the covert power battle going on behind the scenes. Norma Jean was more than a mere vocalist. She aspired to be more than a background harmony and had ideas and a creative mind. However, she was constantly reminded, whether directly or indirectly, that this was Porter's world whenever she fought her independence. Insiders in the industry started talking. Porter allegedly promised Norma Jean more, including larger roles, greater composition credits, and possibly even a more intimate personal connection. Others claim that although she hoped for it, she received evasive promises. Only the fact that Norma Jean was altering could be verified by anyone. Her presence became more frail, but her voice remained pure. Then the pivotal moment arrived. Norma Jean requested greater authority over her compositions. In addition to recording music that the performance required, she also wanted to record songs that related to her personal experiences. Porter paused. It was a reasonable request, but it jeopardized the equilibrium he had established. He liked things organized, he liked to be in charge, and everything started to go apart when that was contested. Behind the scenes, Norma Jean and Porter's relationship gradually deteriorated as the studio lights flickered on and off every week. They were still grinning. The distance between the performances had grown, but they never faltered. With Norma Jean's future at stake, what had started out as respect for one another had devolved into a covert power struggle. She would soon have to make the most difficult choice of her life, one that would transform country music forever and outrage her followers. When Norma Jean found herself at a crossroads in 1967, she made a choice that shocked the country music industry. She announced her retirement from the Porter Wagoner program, where she had been a popular co-star for 6 years. There was only a quick farewell and a silent departure from the stage she had helped define. There was no newspaper controversy or drawn-out explanation. The supporters thought it was abrupt. It seemed inevitable to those closest to the show. Norma Jean was at her breaking point. She was burdened by the control, the whispers, and the emotional weariness. She was grateful for the platform and loved the music, but she no longer felt like an artist. Although she was seen and heard, she didn't feel fully free. She subsequently characterized her departure as an escape rather than a rebellion. Years later, in a rare interview, she stated, "I was young. I simply fled since I didn't know how to defend myself. There was no drama. It was final, but not loud." She was gone in an instant. Porter took her spot in a matter of weeks. Dolly Parton, a teenage singer with huge eyes, replaced Norma Jean in the spotlight. No one spoke it aloud, but the torch had been passed. It was like witnessing someone else enter a life that Norma Jean had worked so hard to create. Porter refrained from discussing the shift in public. He commended Dolly's promise, thanked Norma Jean for her time, and continued. The performance went on. The business turned its attention to the next big star, and the ratings stayed high. However, in private, neither of them ever entirely recovered from the shock of Norma's departure. Norma took a more subdued route and moved away from the crowd. She kept making songs, but she didn't have the same recognition or backing. She was swiftly forgotten by the industry that previously admired her. She didn't regret leaving, though. She was aware of the consequences of staying. She once commented that I had to go because I no longer loved myself there, not because I didn't love it. For decades, her departure was a mystery to her fans. Why would someone quit when she was at the height of her success? Norma now claims that the solution is straightforward: liberty. Not only from Porter, but also from a system that urged women to always smile, sing sweetly, and stay in line. For Norma Jean, the performance, and a kind of country music that favored its women to be quiet and happy. It was the end of an era. However, it also marked the start of something else: the protracted, silent process of taking back her story. Because Norma never forgot, even while the world changed. In addition to a television studio, Dolly Parton found herself in a vacuum when she arrived on the set of the Porter Wagoner show in late 1967. The absence of Norma Jean was new. There was tension behind the scenes as the cameras continued to roll. Dolly was still unaccepted by the crowd. He wasn't only introducing a fresh voice either, Porter. He was attempting to take the place of a presence that had characterized the program for 6 years. Dolly encountered opposition as soon as she showed up. Norma Jean's return was demanded in irate letters from viewers. During early live performances, Dolly was jeered by the audience. Norma Jean had been more than just a vocalist to them. She was the voice of tradition, comfort, and elegance. She was their girl. Following her would be like walking into a storm. Porter, however, remained steadfast. Something in Dolly caught his eye: youngness, aspirations, and a drive similar to his own. She could be shaped, like Norma Jean had been once more. He attempted to mold the narrative, to direct the new chapter of the show according to his wishes. Dolly, however, was unique. Norma Jean observed all of this from afar. Even though she had left the spotlight, she was unable to ignore what was going on. She recognized herself in Dolly, the same vivacious energy, the same drive for achievement, the same vulnerable position as a result of Porter's influence. Norma Jean experienced a mixture of pride and anguish as Dolly gained notoriety. She was fully aware of the costs involved in being at Porter Wagoner's side. Dolly's star grown over time. Porter managed her career, pushed her into duets, and used her in sketches. Dolly, however, struggled for her independence. In contrast to Norma, she composed her own music. When limits were crossed, she retaliated. Eventually, their relationship ended in a well-known and acrimonious separation that was similar to the silent breakup that had occurred with Norma Jean years before. For Norma Jean, it was like witnessing a louder version of history. Dolly would face the things she had faced in private. There were lawsuits. There were charges. Porter turned into a warning about what happens when mentoring turns into possession. Norma Jean, however, never disparaged Dolly. She actually thought highly of her. She once told him, no, it wasn't bitterness. It was truth. Norma had cleared the path, but Dolly had followed it in a different way. Dolly did what I couldn't. By doing this, she revealed what Norma Jean had been too scared or socialized to express out. Some fans still set them against one another. The elegant original Norma Jean, Dolly, the vocal replacement. However, the truth is much more complex. The two women were part of the same mechanism. The same man shaped two voices. One remained silent, the other rebellious. Norma Jean stayed in the background, while Dolly rose to fame, remembering, observing, and waiting for the day when she, too, could finally speak her truth. Norma Jean moved away from the celebrity she previously believed she would never be able to live without after quitting the Porter Wagoner program. The bright lights, the crowded auditoriums, the endless production schedules made her retreat. She was able to breathe for the first time in years. However, something unexpected also arrived with that independence. Quiet. She was forced to confront all she had pushed aside during her ascent, by a silence so profound. Norma Jean continued to sing in the ensuing years, although not on TV. She concentrated on her own faith, made brief appearances at churches and community gatherings, and released gospel records. She was no longer driven by fame. Survival succeeded. Surviving on an emotional level, identity, restoring. She didn't have to be Porter's girl anymore. She now needed to discover the true identity of Norma Jean. Nashville, however, did not wait for her. The industry progressed, rewriting the history of country music without her name at its core. As Dolly rose to fame and Porter kept his position, Norma Jean faded into the background. Retrospectives now hardly ever reference the voice that had formerly received standing ovations. She remained largely silent for decades, never voicing her opinion or looking for publicity. She wasn't ready, not because she couldn't. In the 1990s and early 2000s, that hush eventually started to change. Norma Jean gradually began to open up in interviews and private discussions, not with resentment, but with clarity. She talked about the emotional toll of constantly being what someone else needed her to be, the control she experienced, and her time on the show. In one interview she stated, "I didn't realize how much I'd given up," adding, "Not until I was gone." She didn't portray herself as a victim or accuse Porter of any crimes or scandals, but she was candid about the emotional strain, the possessiveness, and how difficult it was to leave the show, and the notion that her value was dependent on being someone else's creation. Norma Jean said, "I was a different woman back then. You didn't speak out. You just smiled and did your job." However, in her later years, she wanted her story told not for fame or retaliation, but for truth, because she realized that by speaking, she wasn't just taking back her past, but also shedding light on the silent pressures that younger artists still face. At Opry reunions, Norma Jean received standing ovations, tributes from younger artists, and long overdue honors. Her words struck a deep chord with a new generation of fans, particularly women in country music, who had long been told to stand in line, smile, and sing sweetly. Norma Jean was no longer just a former TV star. She was now a voice of experience, caution, and quiet resilience. Perhaps the greatest gift, however, was personal rather than public. Norma Jean had rediscovering her voice, and this time no one else was scripting her script. Porter Wagoner was regarded as a country music icon at the time of his death in 2007. The rhinestone outfits, the syndicated program, the innumerable duets. He was brilliant, charming, and deeply controlling. And as the tributes came in, there was a silent re-examination of his legacy, particularly among the women who stood next to him. Norma Jean had been Porter's brightest co-star, but she understood the cost of being in his spotlight. "He helped me rise," she said, "but he also held the reins tight." Her reflections mirrored those of others, such as Dolly Parton, who later faced a legal battle with Porter after attempting to leave his management. Dolly publicly fought, while Norma Jean quietly escaped the same possessiveness. She didn't try to destroy his memory, only to balance it. Norma Jean's voice, once muted, now echoes louder in hindsight. Porter opened doors but set boundaries that benefited him most. His mentorship was real, but it came with expectations, often unspoken, sometimes suffocating. Different women, same pattern. Over time, more people started to see the whole picture. Norma Jean, 87, isn't chasing the spotlight. Instead, she's reclaiming something deeper. Her voice, her truth. After decades of letting others define her, first as Porter's protege and then as Dolly's predecessor, she's finally telling her own story. She doesn't ask the world to cancel Porter, she just asks for honesty. That behind the fame and sparkle was a man who changed country music and the women in it. She speaks gently, without bitterness, but with the kind of clarity that only time can bring. She remembers how the spotlight used to feel like a dream, until she realized it came with invisible chains. Porter Wagoner gave her fame, yes, but also limitations. She does not intend to accuse, but to explain. She does not intend to relive the past, but to release it. She was at her best, so why leave? Norma Jean knew that if she stayed, she would lose herself entirely. By leaving, she chose her peace. And in the years that followed, she has subtly rebuilt herself. Away from the stage lights but closer to who she really is. A stage, but not freedom. A voice, but only on his terms. Her voice may not be at the top of the charts anymore, but her truth is more powerful than ever because, at the end of the day, Norma Jean's greatest legacy isn't just the song she sang, but the silence she finally broke. She is a symbol of silent strength, a woman who left before leaving was acceptable, and a trailblazer who didn't yell but still made history.